The metallic scraping sound cut through the morning air like nails on a chalkboard. I froze at my kitchen window, coffee mug halfway to my lips as I watched my neighbor Karen dragging a metal garden rake across the pristine black paint of my car. Her face was twisted with pure malicious satisfaction, the kind of expression that belongs on someone who just found the perfect way to ruin someone else's day. She was so focused on her destructive work that she didn't notice two crucial things: the security camera mounted under my eaves that was recording every second of her vandalism, and me, standing in my doorway holding a thick manila Federal Liability Code 14. Let me back up and explain how I ended up in this situation. My name is Marcus, and after spending 8 years overseas working in cybersecurity defense for the government, I had finally returned home to the United States, with enough savings to buy my dream house in Willowbrook Estates, a quiet gated community that promised peace and tranquility. More importantly, I had no left over to fulfill a childhood dream that had sustained me through countless deployments and long nights debugging security systems in foreign countries. I bought a 1967 Chevrolet Camaro that had been sitting in a garage for 30 years. The previous owner had given up on it, but I saw potential where others saw rust and neglect. Every weekend for 6 months, I worked on that car with my own hands. I stripped the paint down to bare metal, rebuilt the engine from the ground up, restored the interior with genuine leather, and painted it in a deep, glossy black that seemed to absorb light itself. Their chrome bumpers gleamed like mirrors, and the engine purged with the deep, throaty rumble that only comes from American muscle done right. The first time I parked it in my driveway, I stood back and admired what I had accomplished. This was not just a car, it was a testament to patience, skill, and the satisfaction that comes from bringing something beautiful back to life with your own 2 hands. I had followed every local ordinance, obtained all necessary permits, and even had the vehicle inspected by the county to ensure it met all environmental and safety standards. Everything was completely legal and above board. That tranquil moment lasted exactly 12 hours. The next morning, while I was enjoying my first cup of coffee and reading the news, I heard sharp knocking on my front door. Not the polite tap of a neighbor introducing themselves, but the aggressive pounding of someone who believed they had authority over me. I opened the door to find a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair, wearing a crisp white blouse and holding a clipboard like it was a weapon of war. "I am Karen Whitfield, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association," she announced without any pleasantries. Her voice had the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "That monstrosity in your driveway is a violation of all community standards and must be removed immediately." I looked past her, at my beautifully restored Camaro sitting peacefully in my own driveway, then back at her with genuine confusion. "I am sorry, but I think there has been some misunderstanding. This is my private property and the vehicle is fully registered and legal. I have all the documentation if you would like to see it." Karen's eyes narrowed as if I had just challenged her to a duel. "This is a prestigious neighborhood with strict aesthetic standards. That loud, obnoxious vehicle lowers property values and creates a disturbance. You have 72 hours to remove it, or you will face fines starting at $500 per day." She thrust a piece of paper at me, which I accepted and read carefully. It was indeed a formal notice citing various homeowners association regulations about non-conforming vehicles and community aesthetic standards. However, something about the way she delivered it struck me as odd. In my years working in cybersecurity, I had developed an instinct for detecting when people were not operating in good faith, and every fiber of my being was telling me that Karen Whitfield was about to become a very big problem in my life. "I appreciate your concern for the community," I replied diplomatically, "but I believe you will find that my vehicle complies with all applicable regulations. I would be happy to provide documentation and discuss this matter further if necessary." Karen stepped closer, invading my personal space with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the power. "There is nothing to discuss. Remove the car or face the consequences. This is not a negotiation." She turned on her heel and marched away, leaving me standing in my doorway with a citation in my hand and the dawning realization that my peaceful retirement was about to become considerably more complicated. But Karen had made a critical error in her assessment of the situation. She assumed I was just another homeowner who would be intimidated by her authority and comply with her demands. She had no idea that I had spent years dealing with much more dangerous adversaries than a suburban homeowners association president, and I was very good at playing the long game. Over the next several weeks, Karen launched what could only be described as a systematic campaign of harassment. Every few days, I would find a new citation taped to my door or tucked under my windshield wiper. She cited me for parking too close to the sidewalk, even though I was well within the legal boundaries of my property. She filed noise complaints, claiming my car was too loud, despite the fact that I re-refrigerated, and never before 8 o'clock in the morning or after 6 o'clock in the evening. She even tried to cite me for excessive washing, claiming that my weekly car maintenance sessions were creating water runoff that violated environmental regulation. Each citation was meticulously documented, complete with timestamps, photographs, and reference numbers. Karen clearly took pride in her bureaucratic warfare, but she was making the same mistake that many of my former adversaries had made. She was so focused on the immediate battle that she was not thinking about the larger war. Every piece of paper she generated was evidence of a pattern of harassment, and he was keeping detailed records of everything. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in early October. I had been working late the night before reviewing security protocols for a consulting client, and I was looking forward to a quiet morning with my coffee and the newspaper. Instead, I was awakened by the sound of scraping metal coming from my driveway. I looked out my bedroom window and saw Karen attacking my car with what appeared to be a metal garden rake. She was not just scratching the paint. She was putting her full body weight behind each stroke, carving deep gouges into the finish that had taken me months to perfect. But that was not the worst of it. After she finished with Theric, she produced a hammer and systematically smashed my left tail light into pieces. Then, as if that were not enough, she pulled out a bottle of household bleach and began pouring it over the hood where it would eat through the clear coat and permanently stain the paint underneath. I watched this destruction with a mixture of anger and amazement. Karen was so consumed with her petty vendetta that she was committing multiple felonies in broad daylight, apparently believing that her position as Homeowners Association president gave her the right to destroy their people's property. What she did not know was that I had installed a comprehensive security system when I moved in, complete with high-definition cameras that were recording everything in crystal clear detail. Rather than rushing outside to confront her, I forced myself to remain calm and think strategically. Years of cybersecurity work had taught me that the most effective response to an attack is not always the most obvious one. Sometimes the best move is to let your opponent continue making mistakes while you prepare your counterstrike. So I watched Karen finish her vandalism, take a few photographs of the damage with her phone as if she were documenting a violation, and walk away with a satisfied expression of someone who believed she had just won a decisive victory. As soon as she was out of sight, I went outside to assess the damage. It was extensive. The deep scratches in the paint would require a complete repaint of the affected panels. The broken taillight would need to be replaced, and finding original parts for a 1967 Camaro is neither easy nor cheap. The bleach damage on the hood was the worst of all, creating permanent stains that could not be buffed out or painted. In total, I estimated the damage at somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000, but instead of feeling defeated, I found myself smiling. Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and she had no idea what was coming next. That afternoon, I spent several hours preparing what I privately referred to as my nuclear option. The manila folder had been carrying earlier contained documents that Karen clearly had not bothered to research. Among other things, it included my application to join the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association Board of Directors, which had been approved 3 months earlier. It also contained correspondence from the County Planning Office confirming that my vehicle met all local regulations, documentation from my insurance company, and most importantly, a detailed analysis of Federal Liability Code 14, which governs the actions of homeowners associations and provides severe penalties for officials who abuse their authority. I had been documenting Karen's harassment campaign from the beginning, but now I had something much more valuable: clear video evidence of her committing multiple felonies while acting in her official capacity as Homeowners Association president. This was not just vandalism, it was a federal civil rights violation, and the penalties were severe. My first call was to the Homeowners Association's insurance provider. I spoke with their claims investigator and explained that I would be filing a substantial claim for property damage caused by an association official acting in their official capacity. I provided them with video evidence, documentation of the harassment campaign, and my preliminary damage assessment. The investigator was professional, but clearly concerned about the liability exposure. My second call was to the local police department. I filed a formal complaint for criminal property damage and provided them with copies of the video evidence. The responding officer was amazed by the clarity of the footage and the obvious premeditation involved. He assured me that charges would be filed within 24 hours. My third call was to the federal compliance watchdog that oversees homeowners association activities. Karen's actions were not just criminal, they were a clear violation of federal fair housing regulations, and I had documentation going back months showing a pattern of discriminatory enforcement. The federal investigator was very interested in my case, particularly when I mentioned that I had been elected to the Homeowners Association board, but had not yet announced my membership. Within 18 hours, Karen's world began to collapse around her. The first blow came in the form of a registered letter from the Homeowners Association's legal counsel. It was a formal cease and desist order directing her to have no further contact with me or my property. The letter also informed her that her act had created a massive liability exposure for the association and that she was being removed from her position as president pending a full investigation. The second blow was a visit from 2 police officers who served her with a warrant for her arrest on charges of criminal property damage, harassment, and abuse of authority. The local prosecutor had reviewed the video evidence and determined that Karen's actions warranted felony charges due to the extent of the damage and the clear premeditation involved. The third blow was perhaps the most devastating of all. Karen discovered that I had been a member of the Homeowners Association board for months and had been quietly decuming every one of her hostile actions. Not only did I have legal standing to challenge her authority, Booty had also been building a comprehensive case against her from the inside. Every citation she had issued, every threatening letter she had sent, every violation she had claimed to document, all of it was evidence of a systematic abuse of power that would now be used against her in both criminal and civil proceedings. But the final blow is still to come. The next evening, the Homeowners Association held an emergency board meeting to address the crisis. Karen had been suspended from her position, but she was still allowed to attend as a resident. She arrived looking haggarded and desperate, clearly hoping to somehow salvage her reputation and authority. What she found instead was a room full of neighbors who had finally learned the truth about her reign of terror. I stood up and presented a detailed timeline of Karen's harassment campaign, complete with documentation, video evidence, and testimony from other residents who had been afraid to speak up before. It turned out that I was not her only victim. She had been systematically targeting anyone who dared to challenge her authority or failed to show proper deference to her position. The accumulated evidence painted a picture of someone who had completely lost sight of the fact that she was supposed to be serving the community, not ruling it. The board voted unanimously to remove Karen from all positions within the Homeowners Association and to ban her from participating in any official. They also voted to support my civil lawsuit against her personally, recognizing that her actions had created enormous legal and financial liability for the association. But the most satisfying moment came when the board president announced that they had received a preliminary estimate for the damage to my car, $14,800, not including legal fees and punitive damages. Karen's face went white as she realized her moment of petty satisfaction was going to cost her more money than most people make in 6 months. The criminal charges were filed the following week. Karen was arrested at her home and charged with felon impropriety, damage, harassment, and abuse of authority. The local prosecutor made it clear that they were seeking the maximum penalty due to the premeditated nature of the crime and the clear evidence of ongoing harassment. The video footage was so damning that Karen's attorney advised her to accept a plea bargain rather than risk a trial. The civil lawsuit was even more devastating. My attorney had calculated damages that included not only the cost of repairing my car, but also punitive damages for the harassment campaign, legal fees, and compensation for the violation of my federal civil rights. The total came to just over $60,000, an amount that would force Karen to sell her house and liquidate most of her assets. 3 months later, I received a cashier's check for the full amount of the judgment. Karen had been forced to sell her house and move to across town. Her reign of terror over Willowbrook Estates was over, and the community was finally free to function as it was originally intended, as a place where neighbors could live in peace and mutual respect. But the story was not quite over yet. Karen's case had attracted attention from housing rights advocates and legal reform organizations. My documentation of her systematic abuse of power became the foundation for new legislation that would prevent Homeowners Association officials from acting with impunity. The video footage of her destroying my car became a viral sensation, generating millions of views and sparking a national conversation about the need for accountability in homeowners associations. 6 months after Karen's conviction, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of how one person's refusal to be intimidated had led to meaningful legal reform. The documentary, titled Homeowners' Rights: The Karen Whitfield Case, won several awards and helped inspire similar reforms in other states. As for my car, it was restored to better condition than before Karen's attack. I used part of the settlement money to have it professionally repainted with a special clear coat that would resist future vandalism attempts. I also added a second vintage muscle car to my collection, a 1969 Dodge Charger that I painted in bright orange with racing stripes. I named it Karma, and I made sure to park it right next to the camera in my driveway where everyone could see it. The final twist came when I received a call from a television producer who wanted to feature my story on a show about people who had successfully fought back against bureaucratic bullies. The episode aired during prime time and reached millions of viewers, making Karen's vandalism attack one of the most famous examples of Homeowners Association abuse in recent history. Today, Willowbrook Estates is a genuinely peaceful community where residents are free to enjoy their homes without fear of arbitrary harassment. The Homeowners Association operates with transparency and accountability, and new regulations prevent any individual from accumulating the kind of unchecked power that Karen had abused. My car sits proudly in my driveway, serving as a daily reminder that sometimes the best response to a bully is to let them destroy themselves with their own actions. Karen learned the hard way that actions have consequences and that underestimating your opponent can be a very expensive mistake. Her moment of petty satisfaction cost her everything: her home, her reputation, her authority, and ultimately her place in the community she had tried so hard to control. Meanwhile, her victim became a symbol of successful resistance against bureaucratic abuse and helped create lasting change that would protect countless other homeowners from similar harassment. But perhaps the most telling moment of this entire saga came during Karen's court appearance for the criminal charges. I was there as a witness, sitting in the gallery, watching as she stood before the judge to enter her plea. Gone was the imperious woman who had marched up to my door demanding compliance with her arbitrary rules. In her place stood someone who looked genuinely broken, dressed in a simple black suit that seemed to hang loosely on her diminished frame. Her attorney had clearly explained the strength of the evidence against her. The video footage was unambiguous. The property damage was extensive and well documented, and the pattern of harassment I had meticulously recorded made it impossible for her to claim this was an isolated incident or a moment of poor judgment. When the judge asked how she pleaded to the charges of felony property damage and harassment, her voice was barely above a whisper as she said, "Guilty." The judge was not particularly sympathetic. He had reviewed the case file, including the video evidence and the timeline of harassment that preceded the vandalism. During his remarks before sentencing, he made it clear that Karen's actions represented exactly the kind of abuse of authority that the legal system was designed to prevent. Homeowners associations exist to serve their communities, not to provide petty tyrants with a platform for harassment, he said, looking directly at Karen. Your actions were not those of a community leader trying to maintain standards. They were the actions of someone who had forgotten that power comes with responsibility and that authority must be exercised with restraint and respect for others. Karen was sentenced to 18 months of probation, 400 hours of community service, and restitution for the full amount of damage to my vehicle that she was also required to attend anger management counseling, and was prohibited from holding any position of authority in any homeowners association for 5 years. The judge made it clear that any violation of the probation terms would result in immediate jail time. As we left the courthouse that day, I found myself reflecting on how completely the tables had turned. 6 months earlier, Karen had believed she held all the power in our relationship. She had seen me as just another resident who could be intimidated into compliance with her arbitrary demands. She had no idea that her target had the skills, patience, and resources to not only defend himself effectively, but to turn her own weapons against her. The civil proceedings were equally devastating for Karen. My attorney had assembled a comprehensive case that went far beyond the simple property damage. We were able to demonstrate a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement of HOA rules, selective harassment of residents who challenged her authority, and a systematic abuse of her position for personal gratification rather than community benefit. During the depositions, several other residents came forward with their own stories of Karen's harassment. There was the elderly gentleman who had been cited repeatedly for having the wrong shade of mailbox, despite the fact that his mailbox was identical to dozens of others in the neighborhood. There was the young family who had been threatened with fines for allowing their children to draw with chalk on their own driveway. There was the veteran who had been harassed for displaying a small American flag on his front porch, which Karen claimed violated aesthetic guidelines. Each story painted a picture of someone who had completely lost sight of the difference between leadership and tyranny. Karen had turned what should have been a straightforward administrative role into a personal thief where she could exercise arbitrary power over her neighbors. The accumulated testimony was so damaging that her insurance company settled the lawsuit for the full amount demanded rather than risk going to trial. But the financial consequences, severe as they were, palled in comparison to the social isolation that followed. Word of Karen's conviction and the circumstances surrounding it spread quickly through the community. Neighbors who had previously been afraid to challenge her authority now felt free to share their own experiences with her harassment. The picture that emerged was of someone who had systematically alienated nearly everyone in the community through her authoritarian behavior. The homeowners association moved quickly to implement new governance policies designed to prevent any individual from accumulating the kind of unchecked power that Karen had abused. They established term limits for all positions, created an appeals process for violations, and implemented transparency requirements that would make it impossible for anyone to use their position for personal vendettas. More importantly, they established a resident advocacy program that would provide support and resources for anyone who felt they were being unfairly targeted by association officials. The program was named the Marcus Rivera Homeowner Protection Initiative, a designation that filled me with pride knowing that something positive had emerged from such an unpleasant experience. The documentary about the case aired 18 months after Karen's conviction, and it had an impact that none of us had anticipated. The footage of Karen methodically destroying my car became a symbol of bureaucratic abuse of power, and the story resonated with homeowners across the country who had faced similar harassment from overzealous association officials. The film sparked legislative action in 12 states, leading to new laws that provided clearer protections for homeowners and stronger penalties for association officials who abused their authority. Several law schools began using the case as a teaching tool for courses on property law and civil rights, ensuring that future lawyers would understand both the importance of homeowners association governance and the dangers of unchecked authority. Karen herself disappeared from public view after selling her house. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved to a small town, several hours away, where she was apparently working as a receptionist at a medical office. According to the stories, Shay had become something of a recluse, avoiding social situations and keeping to herself. Whether this represented remorse or simply an attempt to avoid further consequences, I could not say. What I can say is that the experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of documentation, patience, and strategic thinking when dealing with bullies. Karen had assumed that her position gave her immunity from consequences, and that assumption proved be her downfall. She had also assumed that I would be intimidated by her authority and would comply with her demands rather than fight back. That assumption cost her everything. The ripple effects of Karen's downfall continued to spread far beyond our small community. 3 months after her conviction, I received a call from a producer at a major television network who wanted to feature our story on their primetime investigative news program. The segment, titled "When Homeowners Associations Go Too Far," aired on a Thursday evening and reached over 15 million viewers nationwide. The response was overwhelming. My email inbox was flooded with messages from homeowners across the country who had faced similar harassment from their own association officials. Many shared stories that were eerily similar to my own experience. Arbitrary rule enforcement, personal vendettas disguised as policy implementation, and the systematic intimidation of residents who dared to challenge authority. One message that particularly stood out came from a woman in Arizona whose homeowners association president had been waging a 2-year campaign against her for the crime of planting roses instead of desert landscaping in her front yard. Despite the fact that the roses were thriving and required less water than the mandated desert plants, the association had fined her over $8,000 and threatened to place a lien on her home. Another came from a retired teacher in Florida whose association had tried to force him to remove a small vegetable garden from his backyard, claiming it violated aesthetic standards even though it was completely invisible from any public area. The harassment had escalated to the point where association officials were trespassing on his property to photograph his tomato plants as evidence of violations. These stories and hundreds of others like them painted a disturbing picture of a system that had been designed to protect property values and maintain community standards, but had instead become a vehicle for petty tyrants to exercise arbitrary power over their neighbors. The television segment sparked a national conversation about the need for reform in homeowners association governance. Within weeks of the broadcast, I was contacted by a civil rights attorney who specialized in housing law. She explained that my case had become a landmark example of how to successfully challenge homeowners association abuse, and she wanted to use semi-documentation methods and legal strategy as a template for other cases. Together, we developed what became known as the Rivera Protocol, a comprehensive guide for homeowners facing harassment from their associations. The protocol emphasized the importance of meticulous documentation, understanding the legal framework of an homeowners associations, and building a comprehensive case before taking any action. It also provides specific guidance on how to use technology such as security cameras and digital record keeping to create and sell evidence of harassment and abuse. The guide was distributed free of charge through housing rights organizations and legal aid societies across the country. Within 6 months, we had documented over 200 successful cases where homeowners had used the Rivera Protocol to challenge association abuse and achieve favorable outcomes. The success rate was remarkable, largely because the protocol forced people to build overwhelming cases before confronting their harassers. But perhaps the most significant development came when a group of state legislators contacted me about drafting model legislation to reform homeowners association governance. They had been following the media coverage of my case and were convinced that comprehensive reform was needed to prevent future abuses of power. The resulting legislation, which became known as the Homeowners Bill of Rights, established several key protections for residents of association-governed communities. It required associations to provide clear written justification for any violation citations, established an appeals process for disputed fines, and created meaningful penalties for officials who abused their authority. Most importantly, the legislation required associations to carry liability insurance that would cover damages resulting from official misconduct, ensuring that victims of harassment would have recourse even if the responsible officials lacked personnel assets to satisfy judgments. This provision was directly inspired by my experience with Karen, where the association's insurance ultimately paid for the damage to my car. The Homeowners Bill of Rights was enacted in 17 states within 2 years of my case, and similar legislation was under consideration in a dozen more. Legal experts credited the clear video evidence and comprehensive opt-in in my case with providing lawmakers with a concrete example of the problems they were trying to address. The success of the legislative reform efforts led to an unexpected invitation to speak at the National Conference of State Legislatures about homeowners association governance. Standing before an audience of hundreds of lawmakers and policy experts, I found myself reflecting on how a simple desire to park my restored car in my own driveway had evolved into a national movement for reform. during my presentation, emphasized that the problem was not homeowners associations themselves, which serve important functions in maintaining property values and community standards. The problem was the lack of accountability and oversight that allowed individuals like Karen to abuse their authority without consequence. Effective reform, I argued, required up stronger protections for homeowners and better training for association officials. The conference sold 2 additional speaking opportunities at law schools, housing rights, seminars, and community organization works. Each presentation allowed me to share not just the story of my conflict with Karen, but the broader lessons about standing up to bureaucratic abuse and the importance of using legal and technological tools to protect individual rights. One particularly memorable presentation was at a conference of cybersecurity professionals where I discussed how the skills I developed in my government work had proven invaluable in documenting and combating Karen's harassment. The audience was fascinated. The parallels between defending against cyber attacks and defending against bureaucratic abuse both required careful observation, meticulous documentation, and strategic thinking about how to neutralize threats. The cybersecurity angle also led to consulting opportunities with homeowners associations that wanted to implement better record-keeping systems and transparency measures. It turned out that many of the principles of information security, such as maintaining audit trails and ensuring data integrity, were directly applicable to association governance. Working with these associations gave me insight into the other side of the homeowners association equation. I met dedicated volunteers who were genuinely trying to serve their communities and were horrified by stories like mine. They were eager to implement reforms that would prevent abuses while still allowing associations to fulfill their legitimate functions. These experiences reinforce my belief that the vast majority of homeowners association officials are well-intentioned people who want to do right by their communities. The problem is that the system had few safeguards against the small minority who, like her, and saw their positions as opportunities to exercise power over others rather than to serve the common good. 2 years after Karen's conviction, I received an unexpected piece of news. A former neighbor from Willowbrook Estates called to tell me that Karen had been arrested again, this time in her new town for vandalizing a coworker's car in the parking lot of the medical office where she worked. Apparently, she had been feuding with a fellow employee over some petty workplace dispute and had decided to resolve it by keying the woman's car. The arrest made local news because of Karen's previous conviction in my case. The story described her as a repeat offender with a history of property destruction stemming from personal disputes. This time, however, there was no position of authority to hide behind, no claims of official duty or community standards. It was just a middle who had not learned from her previous mistakes and was now facing her second felony conviction for essentially same crime. The news story included a quote from the victim who said she had never heard of Karen before the incident and could not understand why anyone would destroy someone else's property over such a trivial disagreement. Reading that quote, I was struck by how perfectly it captured the essential absurdity of Karen's approach to conflict resolution. She had spent years believing that her position gave her the right to punish people who disagreed with her, and even after losing everything, she apparently still believed that property destruction was an appropriate response to interpersonal conflict. Karen's second arrest validated my decision to pursue legal action against her so aggressively. Some people had suggested that I should have simply confronted her directly or tried to work things out through mediation, but her repeat offense proved that her behavior was not the result of a momentary lapse in judgment or a misunderstanding about appropriate boundaries. It was a pattern of behavior that would have continued indefinitely if not stopped by legal consequences. The story also served as a powerful reminder to the homeowners in my community about the importance of the reforms we had. Several neighbors mentioned that they had been following Karen's legal troubles and were grateful that her association now had policies in place that would prevent anyone from accumulating the kind of unchecked power that had allowed her to terrorize residents for so long. As I write this, 3 years have passed since Karen first pounded on my door, demanding that I remove my car from my own driveway. The Camaro still sits in that same spot, its paint gleaming in the sunlight, completely restored to its original body. Next to it sits Karma, the Dodge Charger that has become something of a local landmark. Tour groups occasionally drove through Willowbrook Estates, specifically to see the cars that sparked a national conversation about the homeowners association reform. The security cameras are still there, too, quietly recording everything that happens in front of my house. I have never needed to use that footage for legal purposes again, but the cameras serve as a visible reminder that actions have consequences and that anyone who thinks they can abuse their authority without accountability should think again. The scratches on my car were repaired within a week, but the lesson Karen learned will last a lifetime.